Chapter E.2 of the Anarchist FAQ. What do eco-anarchists propose instead of capitalism? Given what eco-anarchists confuse to be the root cause of our ecological problems, as discussed in the last section, it should come as no surprise that they think the current ecological crisis can only be really solved by eliminating those root causes, namely by ending domination within humanity and creating an anarchist society. So here we will summarize the vision of the free society eco-anarchists advocate before discussing the limitations of various non-anarchist proposals to solve environmental problems in subsequent sections. However, before so doing, it is important to stress that eco-anarchists consider it important to fight against ecological and social problems today. Like all anarchists, they argue for direct action and solidarity to struggle for improvements and reforms against the current system. This means that eco-anarchism supports every offer to conserve the environment. And here and now, the key difference between them and environmentalists is that eco-anarchists place such partial struggles within the larger context of changing society as a whole. The former is part of waging a delaying action against the rampant destruction of the environment. The other is a great movement to totally revolutionize the social relations of humans to each other and humanity to nature, Murray Bootkin in towards an ecological society. This is one of the key differences between an ecological perspective and an environmental one, a difference discussed in section E.2. Finding ways to resist capitalism's reduction of the living world to resources and commodities and its plunder of the planet, our resistance to specific aspects of ecocidal systems are merely a starting point in the critique of the whole system and of a wider struggle for a better society. As such, our outline of an ecological society, or ecotopia, is not merely to suggest an indifference to partial struggle and reforms within capitalism. It is simply to indicate why anarchists are confidently ending capitalism, and the state will create the necessary preconditions for a free and ecologically viable society. The perspective flows from the basic insight of eco-anarchism, namely that ecological problems are not separate from social ones. As we are part of nature, it means that how we interact and shape with it will influence how we interact and shape with ourselves. As Recluse puts it, every people gives, so to speak, new clothing to the sound of nature. By means of its fields and roads, and by dwelling and every manner of construction by the way it arranges the trees and the landscapes in general, the populace expresses the character of its own ideals. If it really has a feeling for beauty, it will make more beautiful. If, on the other hand, the great mass of humanity should remain as it is today, crude, egoistic, and inauthentic, it will continue to mark the face of the earth with its wretched traces. Thus will the poet's cry of desperation become a reality. Where can I flee? Nature itself has become hideous. In order to transform how we interact with nature, we need to transform how we interact with each other. Fortunately, Recluse notes, a complete alliance of the beautiful and the useful as possible, quoted by Clark and Martin in Anarchy, Geography, and Modernity. Over the last century, Murray Bootkin echoed this insight. The views advanced by anarchists were deliberately called social ecology to emphasize that major ecological problems have their roots in social problems that go back to the very beginning of patricentric culture itself. The rise of capitalism with a law of life based on competition, capital accumulation, and limitless growth brought these problems, ecological and social, to an acute point, indeed, one that was unprecedented in any prior epoch of human development. Capitalist society, by recycling the organized world into an increasingly intimate, inorganic assemblage of commodities, was designed to simplify the biosphere. thereby cutting across the grain of natural evolution with its ages-long thrust towards differentiation and diversity. To reverse this trend, capitalism has to be replaced by an ecological society based on non-hierarchical relationships, decentralized communities, eco-technologies like social power, organic agriculture, and humanly scaled industries. In short, face-to-face democratic forms of settlement economically and structurally tailored to the ecosystems in which they were located. In remaking society. The vision of an ecological society rests on the obvious fact that people have both positive and negative impacts on the environment. In current society, there are vast differences and antagonisms between privileged whites and people of color, men and women, rich and poor, oppressor and oppressed. Removing these differences and antagonisms and our interactions with ourselves and nature change radically. In other words, there is a vast difference between free, non-hierarchical class and stateless societies on the one hand, and hierarchical class-ridden statist and authoritarian ones, and how they interact with the environment. Given the nature of ecology, it should come as no surprise that ecological anarchists have the forefront of eco-anarchist theory and activism. It would be fair to say that most eco-anarchists, like most anarchists in general, envision an utopia based on communist anarchist principles. This does not mean that individual anarchists are indifferent to environmental issues, simply that most anarchists are unconvinced that such solutions will actually end the ecological crisis we face. Certain of the proposals in this section are applicable to individual anarchism. For example, the arguments that cooperating will produce less growth and be less likely to pollute. However, others are not. Most obviously, arguments in favor of common ownership and against the price mechanism are not applicable to the market-based solutions of individual anarchism. It should also be pointed out that much of the eco-anarchist critique of capitalism approaches to ecological problems are also applicable to individualist and mutualist anarchism as well, particularly the former, as the latter does recognize the need to regulate the market. While certain aspects of capitalism would be removed in an individualist anarchism, such as massive inequalities of wealth, capitalism, and property rights, as well as direct and indirect subsidies to big business, it still has the informational problem associated with markets as well as growth orientations. Here we discuss the typical eco-anarchist view of a free ecological society, namely one rooted in social anarchist principles. Eco-anarchists, like all consistent anarchists, advocate worker self-management of the economy as a necessary component of an ecologically sustainable society. This usually means society-wide ownership of the means of production and productive enterprises self-managed by their workers, as described in section 1.3. This is a key aspect of making a truly ecological society. Most Greens, even if they are not anarchists, recognize the pernicious ecological effects of capitalists' grow or die principle, but unless they are also anarchists, they usually fail to make the connection between the hierarchical forms of a typical capitalist corporation. The capitalist firm, like the state, is centralized, top-down, and autocratic. These are the opposite of what an ecological ethos would suggest. In contrast, eco-anarchists emphasize the need for socially owned and worker self-managed firms. The vision of eco-cooperative rather than hierarchical production is a common position for almost all anarchists. Communist and non-communist social anarchists, like mutualists and collectivists, propose cooperative workplaces but differ in how to best distribute the products produced. The former urge the abolition of money and sharing according to need, while the latter see income related to work and surpluses shared equally among all members. Both of these systems would produce workplaces which would be under far less pressure towards rapid expansion than the traditional capitalist firms. as individualist anarchism aims for the abolition of rent, profit, and interests too, will have the less expansive workplace. The slower growth rate of cooperatives has been documented in a number of studies which show that the traditional capitalist firm owners and executives' percentages share of profits greatly increases the more employees are added to the payroll. This is because the corporate hierarchy is designed to facilitate exploitation by funding a disproportionate share of the surplus value produced by workers to those at the top of the pyramid, as we see in section C2. Such a design gives ownership and management a very strong incentive to expand. Since other things being equal, their income rises with every new employee hired. David Schweikart in Against Capitalism. Hence, the hierarchical form of the capitalist corporation is one of the main causes of runaway growth, as well as social inequity and the rise of big business and oligopoly in the so-called free market. By contrast, equal share worker cooperatives, the ability of more members, simply means more people with whom the available pie will be equally divided, a situation that greatly reduces the incentive to expand. Thus, a libertarian socialist economy will not be under the same pressure to grow. Moreover, when introducing technological innovation or facing declining pressure to grow, pressure for goods, a self-managed workplace would be more likely to increase leisure time among producers rather than increase workload or reduce members of staff. This means that rather than produce a few big firms, a worker-controlled economy would tend to create an economy with more small and medium-sized workplaces. This would make integrating them into local communities and ecosystems far easier, as well as making them more easily dependent on green sources of energy. Then there are other ecological advantages to worker self-management, beyond the relative lack of expansion of specific workplaces and the decentralization this implements. These are explained well by market socialist David Schweikart. To the extent that emission affects workers directly on the job, as they often do, we can expect a self-managed firm to pollute less. Workers will control the technology, it will not be imposed on them from without. To the extent that emission affects the local community, they are likely to be less severe for two reasons. Firstly, workers, unlike capitalist owners, will necessarily live nearby, and so the decision makers will bear more of the environmental costs directly. Second, a self-managed firm will not be able to avoid local regulations by running away or threatening to do so. The great stake that a capitalist firm holds over the heads of a local community will be absent. Hence, absent will be the macro phenomenon of various regions of the country trying to compete for firms by offering the best business climate through fewer environmental regulations. For an ecological society to work, it requires the active participation of those doing productive activity. They're often the first to be affected by industrial pollution and have the best knowledge of how to stop it happening. As such, workplace self-management is an essential requirement for a society which aims to live in harmony with its surroundings. And with itself, the key aspect of social and freedom would be eliminated in the form of wage slavery. For those reasons, libertarian socialism, based on producer cooperation, is essential for the type of economy necessary to solve the ecological crisis. These all feed directly into the green vision, as ecology points to the necessary decentralization, diversity, in natural and social systems, human-scale technology, and an end to the exploitation of nature. John Clark in The Anarchist Movement. This can only be achieved on a society which bases itself on worker self-management, as this would facilitate the decentralization of industries in ways which are harmonious with nature. So far, all forms of social anarchism are in agreement. However, eco-anarchists tend to be communist anarchists and oppose both mutualism and collectivism. This is because workers' ownership and self-management places the workers of enterprise in a position where they can become a patristic interest within their community. This may lead to this firmer firms acting purely in their own narrow interests and against the local community. This would be, in other words, outside of community input and be solely accountable themselves. This would lead to a situation where they become collective capitalists with a common interest in expanding their enterprises, increasing their profits, and even subjecting themselves to irrational practices to survive in the market, harming their own wider and long-term interests, as market pressures have a distinct tendency to produce a race to the bottom. See section L1.3 for more discussion. This leads most eco-anarchists to fall for a confederal economy, a society in which communities will be decentralized and freely give off their resources without the use of money. As a natural complement to workplace self-management, eco-anarchists propose communal self-management. So, although it may have appeared that we focus our attention on the economic aspects of the ecological crisis and its solution, this is not the case. It should always be kept in mind that all anarchists see that a complete solutions in our many ecological and social problems must be multidimensional, addressing all aspects of the total system of hierarchy and domination. This means that only anarchism, with its emphasis on the elimination of authority in all areas of life, goes to the fundamental root of the ecological crisis. The eco-anarchist argument for direct participatory democracy is that effective protection of the planet's ecosystem requires that all people are able to take part in the grassroots level in decision-making that affects their environment. Since they are more aware of the immediate ecosystems and more likely to favor stringent environmental safeguards than politicians, state bureaucrats, and the large polluting special interests that now dominate the representative system of government. Moreover, real change must come from below, not from above, and this is the very source of the social and ecological problems that we face as it divests individuals, communities, and the society as a whole of their power. Indeed, the right to shape their own decentralization as well as draining them of their materials and spiritual resources, the thoughts, hopes, and dreams of the people. Simply put, it should be hardly necessary to explore in any great depths the sound ecological and social reasons for decentralizing decisions-making power, the grassroots of society, to the people who have to live with the decisions being reached. The decentralized nature of anarchists would mean that any new investments and proposed solutions to existing problems would be tailored to local conditions. Due to the mobility of capital, laws passed under capitalism protecting the environment have to be created and implemented by the central government to be effective. Yet, the state, as discussed in section E.1, is a centralized structure unsuited to the task of collecting and processing the information and knowledge required to customize decisions to local, ecological, and social circumstances. This means that legislation, precisely due to its scope, cannot be finely tuned to local conditions, and so can generate local opposition, particularly if whipped up by corporate front organizations in an eco-anarchist society. And decentralization would have the thread of economic power hanging over it, and so decisions would be reached which reflected the actual local needs of the population, as they would be unlikely to want to pollute themselves on their neighbors. Eco-anarchists are confident that such local empowerment will produce a society which lives with rather than upon the environment. Thus, eco-communities or eco-communes are a key aspect of ecotopia. Eco-communes, which get argued, will be networked confederately through ecosystems, bioregions, biomes, and be artificially tailored to the naturally surrounding. We can envision that their squares will be interlaced with streams, their places of assembly surrounded by groves, Their physical contours were placed and tastefully landscaped, their soils nurtured and caringly to foster plant variety for ourselves, our domestic animals, and wherever possible the wildlife they may support on their fringes. They would be decentralized and scaled to human dimension, using recycling as well as integrating solar, wind, hydraulic, and methane-produced installations into a highly variegated pattern for producing power. Agriculture, aquaculture, stock raising, and hunting would be regarded as crafts, and orientations that we hope would be extended as much as possible to the fabrication of use values of nearly all kinds. The need to mass-produce goods in a highly mechanized installation would be vastly diminished by the community's overwhelming emphasis on quality and local permanence. This means that local communities will generate economic policies tailored to their own unique ecological circumstances in cooperation with others. It is important to stress that eco-communities do not simply support local self-sufficiency and economic autarky, as well as values themselves. Decisions that have a regional impact are worked out by confederacies of local assemblies so that everyone affected by a decision can participate in making it. Such a system would be self-sufficient as workplace community participation would foster creativity, spontaneity, responsibility, independence, and respect for individuality. The qualities needed for self-management to function effectively, just as hierarchy shapes those subjects into negative ways, participation would shape us in positive ways which would strengthen our individuality and enrichment of our freedom and interactions with others in nature. That is not all. The communal framework would also adapt on how industry would develop. It would allow eco-technologies to be prioritized in terms of research and development and subsidized in terms of consumption. No more would green alternatives in eco-technologies be left unused simply because most people cannot afford to buy them, nor would their development be underfunded simply because a capitalist sees little profit from it or a politician cannot see any benefit from it. It also means that the broad outlines of production are established at the community assembly level, while they're implemented in practice by smaller collective bodies which also operate on egalitarian, participatory, and democratic basis. Cooperative workplaces form an integral part of this process, having control over the production, the processes, and the best ways to implement any general outlines. It is for these reasons that anarchists argue that common ownership combined with use rights-based systems of possession is better for the environment, as it allows everyone the right to take action to stop pollution, not simply those who are directly affected by it. As a framework for ecological ethics, the communal system envisioned by social anarchy would be far better than private property and markets in protecting the environment. This is because the pressure that markets exert on their members would not exist, as with the perverse incentives which reward anti-socialist and anti-ecological practices. Equally, the anti-ecological centralization and hierarchy of the state would be ended and replaced with the participatory system, which can take into account the needs of local environment and utilize the local knowledge and information that both state and capitalism suppresses. Thus, a genuine solution to the ecological crisis presupposes communism, i.e. participatory democracy in the social sphere. This is a transformation that would amount to political revolution. However, as Bakunin continually emphasized, a political revolution of this nature cannot be envisioned without a social economic revolution based on worker self-management. This is because the daily experience of participatory decision-making, non-authoritarian moves of organization, and personalistic human relationships would not survive if those values were denied during the working hours. Moreover, as mentioned above, participatory communities would be hard-pressed to survive the pressure that big business would subject them to. Needless to say, the economic and social aspects of life cannot be considered in isolation. For example, the negative results of workplace hierarchy and this master-servant dynamic will hardly remain there. Given the amount of time that most people spend working, the political importance of turning it into a training ground for the development of libertarian values can scarcely be overstated. As history has demonstrated, political revolutions that are not based upon social change and mass psychological transformation, that is, by deconditioning from the master-slave attitudes absorbed in the current system, result only in the substitution of new rules, killing elites for the old ones, Lenin becoming the new Tsar, and the communist apparatchiks becoming the new aristocracy. Therefore, besides having a slow growth rate, worker cooperatives with democratic self-management would lay political foundations in the kind of direct democratic political systems necessary to protect the biosphere. Thus, green libertarian socialism is the only proposal radical enough to solve the ecological crisis. Ecological crises become possible only within the context of social relations which weaken people's capacities to fight an organized defense of the planet's ecological and their own environment. This means that the restrictions of participation in decision-making processes within hierarchical organizations, such as the state and capitalist firms, help create environmental along with social problems by denying those most affected by a problem the means of fixing it. Needless to say, hierarchy within the workplace is a prerequisite to accumulation and growth, while hierarchy within a community is a prerequisite to defend economic and social inequality, as well as minority rule, as the disempowered become indifferent to community and social issues, and they have little or no say in. Both combine to create the basis of our current ecological crisis, and both need to be ended. Ultimately, a free nation cannot only begin to emerge when we live in a fully participatory society, which itself is free of oppression, domination, and exploitation. Only then will we be able to rid ourselves of the idea of dominating nature and fulfill our potential individuals in creative force in nature as well as social evolution. This means replacing the current system with one based on freedom, equality, and solidarity. Once this is achieved, social life will yield sensitive development of humans and natural diversity falling together into a well-balanced, harmonious world, ranging from community through region to entire continents. We will see a colorful differentiation of human groups and ecosystems, each developing its unique potentialities and expanding members of the community to a wide spectrum of economic, cultural, and behavioral stimuli. Failing within our purview will be an exciting, often dramatic variety of communal forms here marked by architectural and industrial adaptations to semi-arid ecosystems, then to grasslands elsewhere by adaptation in forested areas. We will witness a creative interplay between individual and group, community and environment, humanity and nature, which can end post-scarcity anarchism. So, to conclude, in a place of capitalism, eco-anarchists favor ecological responsibilities in the form of libertarian socialisms with an economy based around the principles of complementary with nature, decentralization, where possible and desirable, of large-scale industry, reskilling of workers, and a return to more artisan-like modes of production, the use of eco-technology and ecology, friendly energy sources to create green products, the use of recycled and recyclable raw materials, and renewable resources, the integration of towns and country, the industry and agriculture, the creation of self-managed eco-communities which exist in harmony with their surroundings, and self-managed workplaces responsive to the wishes of the local community, assemblies and labor councils which decisions are made by direct democracy and coordinated and appropriate and applicable from the bottom up in a free federation. Such a society would aim to develop the individuality and freedom of all its members in order to ensure that we end the domination of nature by humanity by ending domination of humanity itself. This view of a green society, as put forth by Murray Bookchin, to quote him, we must create an ecological society, not merely because such a society is desirable, but because it is a direct necessity. We must begin to live in order to survive. Such a society involves a fundamental reversal of all the trends that mark the historic development of capitalist technology and bourgeois society. The minute speculation for machines and labor, the centralization of resources and people in gigantic industrial enterprises and urban elites, the stratification and bureaucratization of life, the divorce of people from countries, the objectification of nature and human beings, in my view. This sweeping reversal means that we must begin to decentralize our cities and establish entirely new eco-communisms that are artistically molded in the ecosystem in which they are located. Such an eco-community would heal the split between town and country, indeed, because mind and body, by fusing intellectual with physical work, industry and agriculture, and in rotational diversification of vocational tracks, an eco-community would be supported by a new kind of technology or eco-technology when composed of flexible, versatile machinery whose production applications would emphasize durability and quality towards an ecological society. Lastly, we need to quickly sketch out how anarchists see the change to an ecological society happening, as there is little point in having an aim if you have no idea how to achieve it. As noted above, eco-anarchists, like all anarchists, do not counterpose the ideal utopia to existing as the link between what is and what could be. This implies, at minimum, a two-pronged strategy of neighborhood movements and a workplace organizing it as a means of both fighting and abolishing capitalism. These would work together, with the former targeting, say, the disposal of toxic waters, and the latter stopping the production of toxins in the first place. Only when workers are in a position to refuse to engage in destructive practices or produce destructive goods can lasting ecological change emerge. Surprisingly, modern anarchists and anarcho-syndicalists have been keen to stress the need for a green syndicalism which addresses ecological as well as economic exploitation. The ideas of community and industrial unionism are discussed in more detail in section J5 along with other anarchist tactics for social change. Needless to say, such organization would use direct action as their means of achieving their goals, connected to see section J2. It could be noted that some of Bookchin's socially ecologist followers advocate, like him, green standings in local elections as a means to create a counterpower to the state. As noticed in section J5.14, this strategy, called libertarian municipalism, finds few supporters in the wider anarchist movements. This strategy flows, of course, into the structure of an ecological society, as we discuss in section I.2.3. Anarchists argue that the framework of a free society will be created in the process of fighting the existing one. Thus, the structure of an eco-anarchist society, eco-communism, and self-managed workplaces will be created by fighting the ecocidal tendencies of the current system. other words, like all anarchists, eco-anarchists seek to create the new world while fighting the old one. This means that what we do now is, however, imperfect, and an example of what we propose instead of capitalism. That means that an ecological fashion today in order to ensure we can create an ecological society tomorrow. For more discussion about how an anarchist society would work, see Section I. We will discuss the various limitations proposed to solutions of the environmental crisis in the following section.